You probably use his vocabulary every single day without even, like, realizing it.
Yeah.
You talk about someone having a massive ego, or you joke about having a Freudian slip when you say the wrong word in a meeting.
Right, yeah.
Or you talk about repressing your feelings. But to really understand the man who actually invented those concepts, I mean, we have to talk about some incredibly dark stuff.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We have to talk about, like, botched, horrifying surgeries. We have to talk about a serious infatuation with cocaine as a miracle drug.
Yeah.
And we really have to look at a radically pessimistic, almost terrifying view of human nature.
It's a completely wild foundation for, the words that secretly run our daily lives. So today we are doing a deep dive into a massive stack of historical documentaries, philosophy lectures, and clinical psychology analyses, all centered around Sigmund Freud. And the goal here isn't just to recite a biography, right? The mission is to look past all those cultural cliches and really understand how this one individual essentially split the atom of the human mind. He didn't just study human psychology, he kind of dragged its absolute darkest, most uncomfortable secrets out into the open for everyone to just stare at.
Okay, let's unpack this, because you can't really understand why someone would look at human beings and decide, yep, we're all just walking, talking vessels of dark, animalistic desires without, looking closely at the exact world he was living in. We cannot separate Freud's theories from the Victorian era.
No, absolutely not. That context is everything. I mean, late 19th century Victorian Vienna was a world defined by just intense restrictions.
Right.
But when we look back at that time, it's really easy to just roll our eyes and assume it was arbitrary prudery. Like, these people were just highly conservative, wearing tight corsets and clutching their pearls just for the sake of being proper.
Yeah, but it was much deeper and much scarier than that, honestly.
Yeah.
Reading through the historical accounts, the thing that really strikes you is how terrified this society was. Sex, for instance, wasn't just some taboo conversation topic you avoided at dinner. It was a source of actual physical terror.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the intense social rules of the time weren't just about manners. They were a completely necessary survival mechanism for that society.
Wow, yeah.
You have to remember, this is a world completely without modern, reliable birth control. So a single mistake could result in social ruin or a fatal pregnancy. But even more pressing than that, syphilis was acting as a devastating, completely incurable epidemic across Europe.
Yeah, one of the historical analyses we reviewed made a really chilling comparison. It compared the severity and the sheer terror of the syphilis problem in late 19th century Europe to the height of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s.
It's a really accurate comparison, honestly, because before the invention of penicillin, syphilis was just a death sentence. And it wasn't a quick death either. It was a disease that could lie dormant and then produce this massive range of horrifying symptoms. I mean, blindness, paralysis, severe dementia, the literal rotting away of your body and brain. And it could be passed on to the next generation. So there were massive biological and social risks tied to any kind of sexual expression.
So just imagine living in that. Victorian society was basically a giant pressure cooker, and the release valve was completely glued shut. Like, you are a biological creature. You have these natural evolutionary human instincts. But your society, your doctors, your church, they're all telling you that acting on those instincts could literally destroy your brain, kill your family, and ruin your reputation.
Yeah.
But here's the problem with human energy, right? If you can't express those natural instincts outward, that energy doesn't just evaporate into thin air.
No, it has to go somewhere.
Exactly. It gets forced inward.
And that forced inward pressure is the crucial insight that kicks off Freud's entire career. Because that immense pressure was trapped inside the mind, Freud realized something revolutionary. He realized we are not actually in control of ourselves.
Which was a huge deal at the time.
Oh, massive. To understand how shocking this was, you have to look at what people believed before Freud. For centuries, the reigning philosophical model came from René Descartes. Think of his famous line, I think, "Therefore, I am."
Right, right.
The core assumption of Western philosophy was that the human mind was completely transparent to itself. We are rational captains steering our own ships. We know exactly what we are doing, and we know exactly why we are doing it.
And Freud just walks in with a sledgehammer and shatters that illusion.
Yeah.
He completely destroys this concept of the transparent, rational mind. Like, he splits the human subject in the exact same way physicists of his era were figuring out how to split the atom.
Exactly. He does this by introducing the iceberg theory. So he argued that the conscious mind, which is the part of you listening to this deep dive right now, the part that makes rational choices and pays your taxes, that's just the tiny tip of the iceberg visible above the water.
Just the tip.
Yeah, but the unconscious is this massive, dangerous, hidden underwater mountain. And that hidden mountain is actually what's steering your ship. He divided this entire mental landscape into three distinct warring forces. First, at the very bottom, there's the id.
Let's talk about the id, because I love the descriptions of this. The id is the raw, animalistic pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, and it wants it right this second. It's like a screaming baby that just needs to be fed.
Yes.
Or, to use a modern comparison from one of the philosophy lectures we pulled, think of the id as that completely unfiltered, rule-breaking action hero in a summer blockbuster movie. The guy who just operates on raw instinct. He doesn't care about the law. He doesn't care about collateral damage. He just wants instant gratification and destruction.
Exactly. It's pure drive.
Yeah.
But if everyone walked around acting purely on their id, civilization would collapse in a day. We'd all just be stealing from each other and destroying everything in our path. So as we grow up, society, specifically our parents and our culture, instills the second force, which is the superego. If the id is the wild action hero, the superego is the strict moral rule maker. It's the inner village elder, or like a relentless police officer living inside your head.
Wow.
Yeah, it constantly enforces society's rules, using guilt, shame, and anxiety to keep you in line. It's that nagging voice telling you, you can't do that, you're a bad person for even thinking about that, what will the neighbors think?
Which leaves us with the third force, right? The ego, the reality principle. The way I picture the ego is like an incredibly stressed out politician or a completely overwhelmed referee.
That's a great way to put it.
The ego is trapped in the middle, desperately trying to keep this wild, screaming animal, the id, happy without getting arrested by the strict, judgmental principle, the superego. So the ego is constantly negotiating. It's trying to find a socially acceptable way to let out just enough of that primitive steam so the whole psychological system doesn't just explode.
And we have to emphasize just how exhausting that constant unconscious negotiation is. I mean, it takes a massive amount of psychic energy to keep those dark desires locked in the basement.
So what happens when it runs out of energy?
Yeah.
What happens when it fails to negotiate this battle and the pressure cooker gets too hot?
Well, the repressed energy doesn't just vanish, it converts. It literally mutates into bizarre physical or psychological symptoms.
And that brings us to the breaking point. When the valve breaks, you get what Freud's era called hysteria. And there is a wildly famous case study about a patient named Anna O. We have to talk about her because her story is just wild.
Oh, it really is.
She's a young, highly intelligent Victorian woman who suddenly developed a physical paralysis. She couldn't move her limbs. Even stranger, she developed severe hydrophobia, which is an absolute blinding terror of drinking water. And doctors examined her and found absolutely zero biological cause. Like her body was perfectly healthy.
Her body was healthy, but her ego was failing. So through observation, it was discovered that her intense hydrophobia actually started after she witnessed a dog drinking from a glass of water. She was incredibly disgusted by it. But because she was a proper Victorian lady, she repressed that intense reaction to maintain social decorum. She didn't scream, she didn't complain, she just swallowed the disgust.
Right.
But remember, the energy of that emotion has to go somewhere. The unexpressed emotion essentially mutated. It converted into a physical inability to drink water. And the fascinating part is how she was cured. Because it wasn't with pills or surgery. She was cured by what she called chimney sweeping.
The talking cure. This blew my mind. Like, how does just talking fix a paralyzed limb or a phobia?
Yeah, it sounds like magic, but the mechanism here is free association. She just talked completely without filters. She bypassed the ego censorship. And by talking without holding back, she allowed those trapped, unconscious thoughts to finally bubble up to the surface. And once the hidden trauma was spoken aloud, once the emotion was finally acknowledged, the pent-up energy was discharged, and the physical symptom literally vanished.
That's the power of catharsis. But, I mean, the ego doesn't just fail completely every time like it did with Anna O, right? Most of the time, to prevent us from developing total paralysis, the ego uses everyday tools to cope with the pressure.
Yes, Freud called these defense mechanisms, and you see these everywhere today. Take the mechanism of displacement, for example. Let's say your boss screams at you at work. Your id wants to punch your boss.
Of course.
But your superego knows that if you do that, you'll get fired, go to jail, and starve. So your ego displaces that aggressive energy. It shifts the target to something safer. You swallow your rage at work, you go home, and you snap at your partner for leaving a dish in the sink.
The anger didn't disappear, it just found a socially safer target. But okay, I want to push back on something here.
Yeah.
Everything we've talked about so far is based on the idea that the id is seeking pleasure or gratification.
Right.
But after World War I, Freud's theories took a really dark turn. I have to ask, if we are fundamentally driven by a pleasure principle, why do humans actively seek out misery? Like, if you know a toxic relationship or a terrible habit is actively hurting you, why on earth do you keep going back to it?
What's fascinating here is how the trauma of World War I forced Freud to completely rethink his own theories. You had soldiers returning from the horrific trench warfare of Europe, having experienced just unspeakable things, and they were having recurring, agonizing nightmares. They were vividly reliving the trauma every single night.
Yeah.
Freud looked at this and thought, wait a minute, if the human mind only seeks pleasure, why would the brain actively force a person to relive the worst, most terrifying moments of their life?
That doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. This led him to theorize something called the death drive, or thanatos. He realized that humans don't just seek pleasure. We also have a profound, unconscious urge to seek a return to a state of absolute zero. A state of calm, even if that calm means self-destruction.
We have a compulsion to repeat things. We seek familiar pain. When you apply this to modern life, it is such a light bulb moment for understanding toxic relationships. We repeat painful, destructive patterns with partners because, to our unconscious mind, that pain feels familiar. It feels predictable and safe.
Exactly.
Whereas the unknown territory of a truly healthy communicative relationship feels terrifying and completely out of control.
Yeah.
Our minds will literally choose familiar misery over unknown happiness.
It is an incredibly dark, tragic view of humanity, honestly. We are essentially at war with ourselves. However, it's important to note that we don't all develop severe hysteria, and we aren't all constantly trapped in endless trauma loops.
Right.
For normal, everyday psychological maintenance, the ego has built-in automatic release valves to let out the steam safely.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because those everyday release valves are the things we experience all the time, our dreams and our mistakes. Let's dive into dreams. Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899. And fun fact, it initially sold less than 100 copies.
Really?
Yeah, but it eventually fundamentally changed how humanity views sleep. Basically, he argued that our brains act as special effects directors while we sleep, combining all our hidden anxieties and forbidden desires into these bizarre, symbolic movies.
Right. Think about the mechanics of sleep. When you go to sleep, your strict superego finally relaxes a bit. The inner cop basically goes on a coffee break, but it doesn't shut off completely. So the id sees an opportunity to let out some of its forbidden desires, but it still has to wear a disguise to sneak past the drowsy superego. Freud identified how the brain actually does this.
Yeah, tell us about that.
So one mechanism is condensation, where your mind takes three completely different people from your waking life and just merges them into one single, confusing dream character to represent a complex, tangled emotion you're feeling. Another mechanism is displacement in dreams. Instead of confronting your father and feeling guilty about it, your brain disguises the father figure, and you dream you are fighting a massive tiger instead.
The mind is just a master of disguise. And the most famous example of this is actually Freud's own dream, the Irma's injection dream.
Oh, this one is wild.
It really is.
Ugh.
Freud had a dream about a patient of his named Irma who wasn't getting better. In the dream, he looks into her mouth and discovers she's sick because someone gave her a dirty medical injection. He analyzed his own dream and realized it was actually his mind trying to process a massive waking anxiety over a real-life medical disaster that he felt deeply guilty about. His close friend, the doctor named Wilhelm Flies, had performed a botched surgery on one of Freud's patients. Flies accidentally left a massive piece of surgical gauze stuffed inside the woman's nasal cavity.
Which is just appalling medical negligence. I mean, truly.
It's horrifying. He left a half-meter of surgical gauze rotting in her head. She nearly bled to death when they finally pulled it out, and Freud was traumatized by his association with this. So his dream about Irma getting a dirty injection from another doctor was his unconscious mind's way of displacing the blame.
Oh, absolutely.
His brain was putting on a little play to tell him, see, it's not your fault the patient is sick. It's the other doctor's fault for using a dirty needle. It was a pressure release valve, for his own guilt.
And, the unconscious doesn't just leak out when we are asleep. It leaks out into our waking life through parapraxis.
The Freudian slips.
Exactly. We know these today as Freudian slips. Freud argued for a concept called psychic determinism. This is the radical idea that absolutely nothing in the human mind happens by accident. If you forget a coworker's name or if you accidentally say the wrong word during a toast at a wedding, it is not a random glitch in your memory.
Wait, really? Nothing is an accident.
Nothing. It is your unconscious revealing a hidden, repressed truth. You forgot that coworker's name because, secretly, your unconscious dislikes them and wants to erase them from your reality.
Every single mistake is a hidden message. But, okay, I have to jump in and push back here, because as fascinating as this all is, a lot of this sounds exactly like brilliant literary metaphor.
Sure.
Like the idea of an inner village elder fighting an interaction hero, or the idea that a crocodile in a dream secretly represents my father. It's poetic. But if his theories aren't technically hard science, and the historical records show he literally manipulated his own clinical data, why are we still talking about him today?
This raises an important question, and it goes right to the heart of why Freud is so fiercely debated today. You hit the nail on the head. The biggest critique of psychoanalysis comes from the philosopher Karl Popper, who attacked it on the grounds of falsifiability.
Okay, what does that mean?
Hard science requires that a hypothesis can be proven false. If I say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, we can go to a lab, heat up water, and test it. If it doesn't boil, my theory is false.
Right.
But you cannot go to a lab and prove that a crocodile in a dream does not represent your father. The theory is completely unfalsifiable. It's so flexible that it can explain away literally any contradictory evidence.
Right. If an analyst tells me the crocodile is your father, and I say, no, it isn't, my dad is great and I like crocodiles, the analyst can just smile and say, your intense denial simply proves that I'm right and you are just deeply repressing it. It is a completely unwinnable argument.
It's a closed loop. But to judge Freud solely by the standards of hard physics or chemistry is perhaps missing the entire point of what he was actually doing. Think of the difference between an ethologist, someone like Jane Goodall, who goes out into the jungle to observe the chaotic, natural, messy lives of chimpanzees in the wild. Contrast that with an experimental psychologist like B.F. Skinner. Skinner derived his psychological theories by putting a starving rat in an isolated, highly controlled, perfectly measurable lab box.
Right. Very scientific.
Skinner's science was incredibly precise. But a starving rat pulling a lever in an empty box does not tell you anything about the agonizing complexities of human grief or jealousy or love. Freud was observing humans in their messy, natural, emotional habitat, which was the clinical conversation.
And there's a fascinating translation issue that explains this disconnect, too. When we use the English word science, we immediately think of biology, chemistry, hard data, and lab coats.
Yeah.
But Freud was writing in German, operating under the concept of Wissenschaft.
Exactly.
Wissenschaft just means a deeply organized body of knowledge. It includes hard sciences, sure, but it also includes things like theology, history, and literary criticism. Psychoanalysis was never meant to be a math equation. It operates as a hermeneutic, which is just a fancy academic word for an interpretive lens. To practice it requires phronesis, the ancient Greek concept of practical human wisdom and judgment. You simply can't solve human trauma with a calculator.
That's a vital distinction. Yet, even with that context, we really cannot ignore his profound personal and professional flaws. His absolute dogmatic certainty in his own ideas often led him down really dangerous paths.
Yeah, it did.
Early in his career, he aggressively pushed cocaine as a miracle cure for everything from indigestion to depression. He prescribed it to a close colleague, which led to that colleague developing a severe addiction and dying prematurely. Furthermore, he had a terrible habit of forcing his theories onto his patients.
Yeah, the records on his famous case studies, like the Rat Man or the Wolf Man, they show that Freud acted more like a leading interrogator than a neutral doctor. If a patient's chaotic memories didn't fit neatly into his pre-existing theories, like the Oedipus complex, the idea that a child unconsciously desires to possess their mother and replace their father, Freud would just twist the patient's words until they fit the theory.
He was a brilliant, unparalleled observer of human suffering, but a deeply flawed, biased scientist. And his life ended in a very dark, sobering reality. Despite his fame, he had to flee his home. When the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, psychoanalysis was targeted.
Oh, wow.
His books were burned in the streets. He He barely escaped to exile in London, where he eventually died, suffering from agonizing jaw cancer caused by a lifetime of smoking cigars.
It's a heavy end to a really heavy life.
Uh-huh.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking how Freudian concepts secretly run our daily lives. And the truth is, whether you think he was a genius or a total fraud, his legacy is monumental because he gave us the vocabulary to understand that we are not entirely the captains of our own ships.
Absolutely.
Every time you snap at a loved one after a terrible day at work, or you accidentally forget to set an alarm for a dentist appointment you were dreading, or you wake up sweating from a dream where you were fighting a tiger, Freud's ghost is sitting right there in the room with you, pointing out that your unconscious is pulling the strings.
And in his later, broader philosophical work, specifically a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, he leaves us with a really profound realization. He points out that the very act of being civilized, the act of waking up, being polite, paying taxes, and not acting on every aggressive or selfish impulse that crosses our minds, that requires a painful amount of psychological
I
repression.
know, yeah.
Civilization fundamentally demands that we suffer internally so that society can function externally. To be human is to be conflicted.
Which brings up a final fascinating thought for you to ponder long after you finish listening to this deep dive. Freud built his entire worldview in a highly restrictive, terrifying Victorian era. He theorized that strict societal rules caused deep psychological repression, which made everyone neurotic. But look at our world today. You are living in a hyper-open digital era where absolutely everything is shared online. Everything is overanalyzed, boundaries are completely dissolved, and very little is considered taboo anymore. So ask yourself, has this newfound radical freedom actually cured our neuroses and made us happier? Or has our ego simply adapted to the noise, inventing entirely new, modern defense mechanisms to protect us from the overwhelming reality of ourselves? It's definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself scrolling endlessly to avoid your own thoughts.